morning. For the new folks that are joining us here in the All Lands Approach to Sustaining Minnesota Forest Habitats and Wildlife Symposium that is being hosted by our Minnesota Forest Habitat Collaborative. We just finished a presentation about what the collaborative is, and now Mike Larson, our DNR lead for our Forest Wildlife Research Group, is going to share the habitat needs of forest wildlife.
Thanks, Julie. I'd like to begin by acknowledging my co-authors for this talk, Alexis Grindy in the Avian Conservation Wildlife Ecology Lab at NRI here in Duluth, and 4 scientists and project leaders in our research group in Grand Rapids, Glenn Delgelise, John Erb, Dave Garcelis, and Charlotte Roy. They get credit for engaging in conversations going back a couple months about this presentation, this topic. Trying to squeeze all things wildlife into one talk is a little bit of a daunting task. So by the end, you'll see that I'm kind of cursorily addressing a variety of topics, just enough to get you thinking, hopefully. But I do also have to acknowledge that my procrastination in preparing presentations means that they haven't actually seen the final product yet. So any faults that there are mine alone. So we have three objectives for this presentation. I'd like to explain why we should incorporate wildlife considerations into forest management, hopefully easy so. And secondly, to describe what a few of the important wildlife considerations are when we approach forest management. And finally, to explain why, in the theme of the symposium, an all-lands approach is good for wildlife. And to do that, the talk is basically 3 parts, one slide for an introduction. Spend most of my time talking about what we know and what some of those wildlife considerations are, and then one slide at the end with some things that we'd like to know, at least like to know better than we do now. So habitat is a species-specific concept. So when we talk about wildlife habitat, what we really mean is habitat for whatever species we have in our head at the time. So with that idea that it's a species-specific concept, we can't manage for all wildlife species on one given plot of land. It's simply impossible. What's good for one species might be detrimental to the habitat of another species. And so what that brings to the foreground, I'm going to just kind of begin and end this presentation on something that came up immediately in the questions after the last presentation, is this idea of values. Science is going to help us figure out how to accomplish what we want to accomplish, but it doesn't tell us what we should accomplish. We need to spend a lot more time talking about values and the subjective judgments and the decisions we make about what we want to accomplish on the landscape at any given place. And in the broadest context, they say statewide here, but public natural resource agencies and wildlife professionals are tasked with managing wildlife resources in the public trust. And what that means is the public trust, the beneficiaries of that trust are all citizens, not just the ones that speak the loudest, not just the ones with the most political clout, and it's not even just all stakeholders and all citizens now, it's all publics now and into the future. That's a pretty, requires a pretty holistic approach and thought process when it comes to managing wildlife. But that being said, again, at a more local level, it's entirely okay and in fact necessary to be thinking more narrowly about what are we trying to accomplish when it comes to wildlife, which species, which groups are we talking about. Now getting into what we know, the first thing I want everyone to know and take home as a take-home point is that managing for wildlife habitat is darn complex. There's some various reasons for that. One of those is the whole values idea, and figure out what it is we're trying to do at a given place and time. And that involves thinking about and engaging lots of different stakeholders with different views, and those views change over time. And the views in one landscape might be different than they are in another. And so just the idea of engaging stakeholders and determining what the values are and what the objectives are for habitat management is very complex in and of itself. Once you decide what you want to do for wildlife habitat, then you have to consider all the complexities of how wildlife interact with their environment that determines habitat needs. And so we think about habitat in a species-specific context, and it's even more complicated than that because what a young animal of a particular species needs is different than what an old animal of a given species might need. And so habitat requirements vary throughout the year over different spatial scales and time scales. So I have a couple examples here. The line drawing for succession, that top left is showing that for a couple early, what we think of as early successional bird species, woodcock in the upper right there, actually utilize lots of different age classes of forest. Same with ruffed grouse, which is whose needs are represented in that lower left diagram. That again, not only do they use forests of different ages, but actually need forests of different ages and different habitat requirements at different seasons and different parts of their life cycle. And in the lower right shows the annual cycle of the redstart. So think of migratory bird species or other migratory species that have very different seasonal requirements and habitat requirements along their migration routes and things. So just give you the flavor for the idea that habitat management for wildlife is very complex. The basis of wildlife management and wildlife habitat management boils down to this idea of limiting factors. There's a set of life history characteristics that every species has that determine what its basic needs are in terms of food, cover, water, other resources. And in any given place and time, one of those resources that critter needs is in the most limited supply. And so if you provide more of that resource, then it allows more of those critters to exist. So we're trying to address what's most limiting for a particular species or population. And in a lot of cases, it is habitat, some component of habitat that's limiting, but that's not always the case. So just putting that out there, that you won't always see a wildlife population response in response to certain habitat manipulations if you haven't actually addressed the limiting factor, or if the limiting factor is something other than habitat. And again, this is something that can vary over time. Another thing we know is that diversity is good. That clearly is a value statement. It's not a scientific statement. But I'll back that up just a little bit here. So from a values perspective, if we value quality of life, we value having both providing jobs and economic opportunities as well as long-term resource conservation. Diversity helps with those values. And from a scientific perspective, if we, assuming that we value and care about ecosystem functions and having robust and resilient systems that can deal with change over time in a positive way, there's a scientific basis showing that diversity, biodiversity, improves those characteristics. So certainly valuing these things, there is scientific support for that. But so I have a couple slides here on diversity. We think about spatial scales, a lot about spatial scales in wildlife habitat. So again, thinking about incorporating wildlife considerations into forest habitat management, forest management, we need to think about spatial scales. Everything from a local plant community up to forest stands, landscapes, and globally, all spatial scales. And think about the fact that most human activities impact lands unevenly across the landscape. So there's spatial, the needs for addressing impacts on habitat vary spatially. So a couple examples would be human development, land cover conversion does not occur evenly across the landscape, and things like timber markets affect demand for wood products in some places more than others. And that's a consideration that we need to think about when we're dealing with habitat management. And likewise, we need to think about temporal scales, and this was touched on with some of the questions at the end of the last talk, is basically what is the baseline year that we're comparing things to. And that's a question I'll leave, just putting it that way. But again, from a wildlife perspective, we go all the way back to the idea that wildlife adapted to their environment and to their habitats over a very, very long period of time. More recently, human cultures affected our landscape and have been affecting the landscape for a very long time as well, thousands of years. And then we think about European settlement and the initial logging of old growth in Minnesota that occurred in a certain time period that affected forests in Minnesota to a great degree. And then even more recently, market increases, increasing harvest that goes through cycles, and so there are times when there's less demand and fluctuating harvest. Again, to drive home the point of temporal scale diversity, or the idea of temporal scales, is a figure from one of Glenn's long-term deer studies showing snow cover by week across 15 years. Each line is a different year. So you can see that not only does snow cover, snow depth vary within a late winter season, but across those years is quite variable. And so for something like deer, the deeper the snow gets, the more difficult it is to move around, the more they rely on certain habitats, more than they do in low snow conditions. Likewise, there's lots of wildlife that rely on snow and snow cover for thermal cover protection in the winter, whether it's ruffed grouse, snow roosting, or small mammals, and things that prey on small mammals, doing that under the snow surface. So again, their needs vary for forest structure and composition differently in years with high snow versus low snow. And we need to account for that when we deal with wildlife habitat. The other example here of important wildlife considerations is the idea of habitat specialists. In a very gross sense, we talk about some wildlife species being generalists and some being specialists. Generalists can occur across a wider variety of landscapes and in our case, forest conditions. Others, though, have very specific habitat needs. And it's good to consider what some of those are for the species that we care about, the species that we're trying to manage for, is what are those more specific habitat needs of those habitat specialists that we might miss if we're just thinking about providing wildlife habitat in general. And a couple examples here, of course, wood ducks, cavity nesters, so they need access to cavities, but then not only that, but those cavities have to be near water as one example of a pretty specialized habitat need. And Connecticut warblers are another species considered a habitat specialist, focusing on global and conflict forests. So another thing we know about wildlife habitat in forests is that structure and composition are important. And structure and composition in a very general sense and very specific sense. But in forest management, and when wildlifers are working in forests, we're often talking about cover types and age classes. And that's how we talk about structure and composition in a lot of conversations and a lot of thought processes. And sometimes that's sufficient. Sometimes that's easier. And so barring an example here from Mark Hansen, showing, again, that upper right, this is a map showing population trends in woodcock from the late 60s through, I think, like 2012 or something like that. But over that relatively long period of time, Minnesota is the only state on this map in northeastern Minnesota with a significantly increasing woodcock population. And by comparison, the states of Wisconsin and Michigan, neighboring Great Lakes states, had declining populations of woodcock. And so if we look at a very gross scale, what the habitat conditions are for this early successional forest species, the graph on the left is showing diameter size classes. The group on the left is Minnesota. The other two are Wisconsin and Michigan, showing that distribution of area of forests, this is FIA data, is much more even in Minnesota, but the other two states, much less area in small diameter trees, much more area in high diameter trees. And then the temporal time series plot on the right showing again the area of aspen specifically that's less than 20 years old. And so declining area of young aspen in those two states over the same time period. Again, the time frame on that x-axis is the mid-1960s through about 2015. Another idea I want to put out there is that when we talk and think of forests and forest management in terms of age classes and cover types, a lot of times individual species won't be sensitive to changes in that characterization of habitat or forest structure and composition. But if you take something like forest songbirds, you can look at the whole community of songbirds by cover types and age classes, and you can observe changes or differences in the bird community over space and time that might be correlated with age classes and cover types. So if we're stuck talking about age classes and cover types, there are community-based wildlife indicators that might be better metrics than individual population response. Although we talk about cover types and age classes a lot, from a wildlife perspective, it's often much more complex than that. When you think about structure and composition in many other ways than just cover types and age classes. So a couple examples here, again, ruffed grouse in the lower left, and showing a couple photos there of forests in which they might occur. So you just take aspen cover type, for example, and maybe a 30-year age class provides habitat for ruffed grouse at a certain time of year. But not all 30-year-old aspen stands are the same. The one on the right is actually a birch stand most people probably see. Couldn't find the appropriate aspen. But anyway, it's something that's more diverse within the stand with, say, a balsam fir component, an advanced balsam fir component, is better habitat for that age class of aspen for grouse than the stand on the left without that extra structural and species composition diversity. The other example comes from Dave Grashels's bear research in Spencer Rutler's graduate work, where they're comparing bear food. So a huge component of bear habitat is foods. Dave Grashels looked at bear foods and availability when he first started working for the DNR in the 1980s. And Spencer and others went back and looked at forest stands, the graph in the lower right. The top set of graphs are 30-year-old aspen stands. And the bottom set are what they refer to as regen stands, so 5 to 15-year-old aspen stands. And the bars on the left are the 1980s compared with the more recent, so that's the time comparison left to right. The left set of bars is plant abundance, species plant percent abundance. And on the right is the biomass of foods. So I just want to point out quickly the top color here, there's showing a dozen or more species of plants that produce food for bears, and the top, I don't even know what color that is hazel. So we can see that in both older stands and younger stands, hazel either increased in abundance or stayed the same in abundance. But in terms of the food produced, it is just this sliver at the top here. But the amount of fruits, the number of hazel nuts produced in these stands that, again, same cover type and age class, same overstory canopy cover, produced a lot less bear foods. So on the surface of it, if you're just looking at the trees and the overstory cover type, we wouldn't know that some forest stands now are producing much lower quality bear habitat because they're producing fewer foods. Another wildlife habitat consideration is area sensitivity. A lot of human activities over time have served to reduce patch sizes. So we heard in the first talk that there's the collaborative is interested in the diversity of patch sizes on the landscape. In a lot of cases, it's the larger patches and the species that rely on larger patches of habitat that are currently most limiting. So development, other activities create fragmentation and reduce patch sizes. and a couple species examples, sharp-tailed grouse, the more open land species, but they require large complexes of open lands to support a population of sharp-tailed grouse. Perhaps a better forest example is goshawks and their habitat needs. Large areas of older forest. Doesn't always have to be the same patch from our perspective in terms of forest stands, but from the birds' perspective, their area of contiguous habitat, what they view as habitat, needs to be a contiguous area and quite large area compared to the way we view the patches of land that we manage. Perhaps the last, oh yeah, it says something on the bottom, this would be the last. Wildlife consideration is the idea of connectivity. So animals need to move, wildlife needs to move for a variety of reasons. Some of it might be seasonal, like herps, migrating and moving between uplands and wetlands seasonally for their habitat needs. It might be wildlife. Often some wildlife populations occur as a metapopulation, meaning that there's a self-sustaining population or populations of wildlife occurring in one area, and they're somewhat separate from a population in a nearby area, but there's some limited amount of migration and movement of individuals across what would normally be considered not habitat, but there's movement of individuals at a low level between these metapopulations. And so we need to think about metapopulations and how far apart habitat patches are that might sustain a population of this particular species. And so spruce grouse, in studies from out east, as their habitats became more fragmented and losing habitat, spruce grouse populations started demonstrating more of a metapopulation dynamic in terms of their patches of occupied habitat becoming further and further apart. And it became, so now we know a fair bit about the minimum habitat patch size for spruce grouse and how far apart or how close those patches need to be to sustain the metapopulation over a period of time. And of course, then you think of something like climate change and the very large-scale movements of wildlife range that are occurring slowly over time, that there's a need for both wildlife and plants to shift their ranges due to climate change. We need to be thinking about that when we manage forests for wildlife. So in summary, I would argue that an all lands approach for wildlife management in forests is a good thing. And that's because although at a local scale, we need to focus, if you're going to incorporate wildlife habitat considerations, it might be for only one or a few species. So in order to account for more species and the full suite of wildlife species, you need to be thinking about and coordinating and planning at a much larger spatial scale across ownerships. And secondly, these last few important wildlife habitat considerations fall squarely in the landscape scale for considerations. The connectivity, the area sensitivity, so again, the larger spatial scales we're thinking about and planning, the better it will be for wildlife in the aggregate. So just two slides left here. First, one quick text slide on what we'd like to know more about. So first, and we started here too, is this idea of stakeholders, values, balancing the needs of multiple interests in our forested landscapes. And how do we go about that? Having a collaborative and having diverse people come together and have open conversations is a great start and move in the right direction. But I think we have a long way to go in terms of being clear and explicit about how we set goals and objectives and how we try to strike those balances between the different needs that different stakeholders and different people have on our lands and in our forests. So that's an issue or something that can be improved at the local planning scale and within organizations and agencies. But then you add the all lands perspective and multiple agencies, large landscapes, that idea of talking about and agreeing on trade-offs between different values is that much more difficult and complicated, and we need to figure that out. I don't think we're there yet. The middle bullet there, because wildlife management is based on addressing limiting factors, we'd really like to know what the current status of the habitat is. And there are lots of good reasons that we want to know the status of forests for other reasons. And so improving our data and our information about status and monitoring, both of forests and specific habitat characteristics that are more than or different from some of the traditional forest inventory metrics that are very good for what certain people need, but not necessarily everything that we might want or need to know in terms of managing wildlife habitat. So make a pitch for decision, what I would refer to as decision relevant monitoring. There's a reason it's hard to make decisions about wildlife management, especially when we're working in forested landscapes. And some of that, a lot of it, is due to value differences. But to the extent that some of it is due to uncertainty about what particular management actions or management approaches will do for wildlife, either for good or bad, to the extent there's uncertainty about that, we could do better monitoring, more targeted monitoring to reduce that decision-specific uncertainty and not just uncertainty in some broad sense. And uncertainty exists in wildlife habitat needs still. We have a lot of well-studied species, and for those, the more we learn, the more we know that we don't know, and the more we realize how much more complicated it gets. Also, I'll acknowledge there that much of wildlife management or wildlife research and wildlife research into habitat needs doesn't always occur in the framework and from the perspective of informing forest management. And so there are improvements and moves we can make in that direction from a wildlife research perspective. And then that top bullet there is the bigger one in terms of there are lots and lots of wildlife species out there that we know very little to almost nothing about in terms of their habitat needs. And they come to the forefront and become important once they're rare and declining, which makes them very difficult to study. So to the extent that biodiversity is a value that we want to care for over time, and to the extent that we do want to provide benefits to all beneficiaries and all citizens now into the future, I think we have an obligation to provide habitat and consider wildlife habitat needs of all wildlife species, and including the ones that have been ignored so far. So in summary, and finally, I'll just return to those objectives. And these are what I would hope you take as take-home points from today, is that we should incorporate wildlife habitat considerations into forest management. Wildlife habitat doesn't just happen automatically. So we should be explicit about incorporating wildlife considerations, and hopefully have some idea of what some of the basic and important considerations are for thinking about wildlife when you approach forest management. And finally, to endorse the theme of the symposium, the idea that an all-lands approach and a larger, more spatially diverse perspective is better for wildlife in the aggregate as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mike. We have a minute for a couple of questions. Okay, we got one in the back.
Yeah, so Mike, you mentioned that human activities are impacting the landscape in a heterogeneous way. And to some extent, I take heart that helps some of that diversity, but that can't handle, or that it encourages diversity, it makes some diversity just happen on its own. Do you have a comment on that? And it sounds like that probably doesn't cover the diversity that we need, just my guess is what you might say, but I want you to say what you want to say.
Good question, thanks. Yeah, I think you're right that those impacts get very spatially does create diversity at a certain spatial scale and to certain spatial extents. But that doesn't address the needs of all wildlife, because there are wildlife that need diversity at different spatial scales. So it's fine to have that diversity at that spatial scale for some species, but to the extent that it doesn't address diversity at all spatial scales is the problem in some cases.
Okay, one more.
I agree that an all-lands approach is certainly best, but I guess my question is, when you're dealing with such a highly parcelized landscape that's only continuing to get more parcelized, how do you go about dealing with private landowners to explain to them that, well, maybe you shouldn't cut this down because this is the only habitat type within this area or complex? How do you approach landowners with something like that when you want this all lands approach and the parcels are very small?
I don't know. We need to, and we should. And the collaborative is an example of bringing agency and organizational people together to start that coordination at that level. And again, it was brought up after the last talk that we need to incorporate private lands and private landowners into this approach and this thought process as well. So I think the need is there, and we should, but how best to do that is something I don't know much about.
As a former private lands person, I know exactly what you mean, and I always felt it was my duty. You can't make a landowner do something, but it is our duty to share the best information, the best science with them as professionals so they can make well-informed decisions, share the landscape goals with them, share the techniques, what they can do tell them what the species of greatest conservation need are in their neighborhood and how their neighborhood is special. And then incentivize those things, whether it's through NRCS Farm Bill programs or our cost share through PFM, things that we think are critical to get done, incentivize those, make the cost share greater, different tools like that. Okay, we're going to take a break then and start again at 9:10. Thank you very much, Mike.